Hi, I'm Talia Baroncelli, and you're watching theAnalysis-news. Joining me in a bit is Justin Joque, the author of Revolutionary Mathematics. We'll be speaking about algorithms and the statistical models on which financial systems are based around and other models of digital control. But first, before we get started, it would be great if you could go to our website, theanalysis.news, and get on our mailing list. That way you're updated every time there's a new episode. You can also donate to the show by hitting the red button at the top right corner of the screen. And also like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Analysis-news, or to whatever other podcast service that you're using. Stay with us, and we'll be back in a bit with Justin Joque. Joining me now is Justin Joque. He's the author of Revolutionary Mathematics, Artificial Intelligence, Statistics, and the Logic of Capitalism. He's also a visualization librarian at the University of Michigan. Thanks so much for joining me, Justin.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Well, it just so happens that it was an algorithm which took me to your book, and a recommendation algorithm, so it's pretty fitting that we're speaking about algorithms and statistical models today. Your book essentially looks at different statistical models and argues that there's a sort of metaphysical or philosophical assumption in a lot of these models that they are essentially trying to maximize a certain payoff or reward. And this actually lends itself to capitalist accumulation and to the financialization of the markets that we've been seeing over the past few decades. So why don't we start with what actually compelled you to write this book in the first place?
Sure. I think the thing that compelled me was there was a sort of growing literature about algorithms and especially algorithmic bias, like Safiya Noble's book, Algorithms of Oppression, and Virginia Eubanks has also written about this. And I found a lot of this work really compelling and super interesting, but it struck me that one piece that was missing was sort of how these algorithms get their power, how the decisions sort of are made, and then the larger questions of political economy in which they function. And also thinking about the ways that algorithms sort of pick up on what capital had already been doing. I mean, there are all these systems for sorting workers, for sorting people, and treating them in biased ways in terms of their access to capital, their access to job, their access to housing. And so in so much as a lot of these books and arguments about algorithmic bias were showing how algorithms were repeating earlier forms of bias, I thought that there kind of needed to be an extra step to think about the ways in which, that we couldn't just fix the problem at the level of the algorithm, that it also was part of this much larger social problem.
Yeah, because I mean, we can observe different instances of that in the world that we live in. For example, populations being controlled by digital systems such as, workers, immigrants, even inmates who have been newly released. They're still sort of controlled by these digital systems. And there's one instance in your book, which you describe, which is great. Well, I mean, quite frustrating if you're in that position, but, think of yourself as being at an airport and going to the gate of an airport and essentially asking the worker there to help you change your flight. And then they say, sorry, I can't override the system. I can't do anything for you. So that's an instance in which we've entrusted, so much power to these computer systems.
Right. Yeah. And I think that one of the really important parts about it is that, so these systems are making these decisions, but then there are these much larger apparatuses of sort of juridical power that are being used to enforce the decisions. And then also all of the sort of mechanisms of auditing them or protesting decisions are now being sort of stripped away. One of the examples that happened around the time that I started thinking about the book, and I think was really informative for me, was this, it's called MIDAS, the Michigan Data Automation System. And it was this system, and part of what it did was try to automatically detect unemployment fraud. So people who lost their job would get unemployment insurance, and if people were scamming the system, it was supposed to cut them off. And it turned out this software, I think they spent a couple $1 million on it. It turned out this software just didn't work work at all. And it was tens of thousands of people lost their unemployment insurance because the system, said that they were committing fraud. They had gotten rid of all of the people who were making these decisions manually, and all the people who could audit it. A lot of these people, it took 5-6 years in order to get the money back. They had to go through the court systems. And if you're on unemployment insurance, you can't wait 5-6 years for the money that you need. And so I think it's a really interesting example because it's not even a question of the algorithm being like biased or anything like that. It was just flat out wrong. And the implications were horrendous for the people who were affected. So thinking, both about the algorithms, but then also all of the sort of political and economic power behind those decisions and the ways in which they affect people's lives.
Well, someone like me, who only has a cursory understanding of statistics, I think your book really helped me understand the different models that are being used. So you speak about frequentist statistical models as well as Bayesian statistical models. And you essentially argue that there really isn't a thing that is probability. I mean, aside from the complexities of quantum mechanics, where something could be maybe both 30% probability of whatever happening as well as 7 or 60% at the same time. Whereas, outside of that realm, that's not really possible. And you argue that probability is not really a thing. We set these sort of parameters based on what knowledge we have and what we've observed, and we input that into these models. And what it gives back to us is not, a scientific truth. It is something that's interpreted within the context of these models. So maybe you can speak about frequentist versus Bayesian statistical models and the differences between the two.
Yeah, so that's a central component of the book, and it really does, sort of start with this this insight that it is in some ways counterintuitive, but I think also very intuitive once you sort of start thinking about it. And it's exactly like you said, that there is in sort of the real material world, there's no such thing as probability. Like you flip a coin and it lands on heads or tails. It doesn't 50% land on heads or 50% land on tails. And so probability really is, I think, definitionally a metaphysical category. It's a sort of an intellectual supplement to the world that we've created in part because out of a lack of knowledge, right? It's because you flip a coin and, you could probably model physically the air currents and exactly, the forces and figure out how it would land. But normally when you flip a coin, you don't know. And so probability is kind of this additional supplement that we add to the world in order to deal with situations that we don't know. And so in the book, I trace this sort of shift from frequentist statistics to Bayesian statistics, and there are a lot of sort of important components to it, but to really kind of try to boil it down to its essence, in frequentist statistics, which were very sort of popular in the beginning of the 20th century up until about the 70s or 80s, but this is really what's taught in an introduction to statistics class. The way that probability is given a certain objectivity, it's called, the frequentist statistics refers to itself as an objective theory of probability. The idea is that you take a long run of something and then you measure the frequency. So you can't, under sort of a really rigorous frequentist framework, you can't assign a probability to an individual coin flip. You have to have a series of, let's say, 100, 1,000, 10,000 coin flips. And if half of them are heads and half of them are tails, then the probability is 50% heads, 50% tails. So it's objective in the sense that it's a measurement of a frequency, but it still, in a certain sense, has a lot of subjectivity to it, because you have to define what's called the reference class. You have to say, okay, these are it's only when I'm flipping a coin on these days that I'm considering this specific coin, or, this specific model for making weather predictions. You still have to sort of define the experiment and what counts as an instance. Conversely, Bayesian statistics, which has become sort of more popular in the 80s, although it really traces back to the 19th century, is a subjective theory of probability. So instead of having it be based on this, this long run frequency, it's really based on my individual knowledge of the situation. And the mathematics of Bayesian statistics allow you to sort of have your guess. So like, I think that this is a fair coin. I think it's a 50% chance of heads. And then as I observe more flips, there's the mathematical formula called Bayes' theorem that allows me to update. So if I see 10 heads in a row, I might think, okay, maybe this coin is actually biased towards heads, and using Bayes' theorem, you can kind of update from your probability. And so what it allows you to do is start with a subjective theory of probability. And as you observe more and more instances or get more and more data, then the idea is that your probability should become more objective because it's based less on your sort of prior ideas of what things were and more on the data that you've observed. And then I think, and I'm sure we'll talk more about this, but I think one of the important things to note is that even though it's subjective, it's actually much more easy to automate than frequentist probability, because frequentist probability requires, sort of setting up an experiment, and you can't assign a probability to an individual event. Like say you go to a website and it wants to give you an ad. There's not a sort of properly frequentist way that you could say, okay, I think there's a 2% chance you're going to click on this ad. Whereas because Bayesian statistics are subjective, you can assign a probability to an individual event, like you click on an ad, and you can automate the mathematics of getting more data. So it's subjective in the sense that it's from a specific sort of epistemic point based on the data that's observed, but it's not necessarily subjective in the sense that it's like a person, it has to be a person. The math can be done quite rigorously so that it can be automated.
Well, not to get too into the details of Bayesian statistical models, but I think it was founded by a priest or a theologian, Thomas Bayes, who, I think this is, maybe halfway through your book where you're speaking about Bayes and how he obviously believed in God. And so there's this subjective element, but it still has a notion of this, I guess, objective truth, which is a deity as being, the thing which determines everything. And you sort of explain how this deity can then be replaced by the market or the truth of the market. Could you explain how a lot of the models that we have in, say, like the trading of derivatives and different sort of financialization models and very, very fast automated ways of trading are based on this assumption that the market is, the absolute truth, which is allocating things in a very specific way, in a way which is rational and objective?
Sure. So I think there are a number of components kind of at play there, but absolutely. So it starts, Bayesian statistics is kind of invented by Reverend Thomas Bayes in the 19th century. And one of the sort of the problems that you run into as soon as you accept a subjective theory of probability is that it's really difficult to evaluate whether you're right or wrong, right? Because if I say there's a 60% chance of it raining tomorrow and it doesn't rain, you can't say, oh, no, you were wrong. You said there was a 60% chance of rain, because the 40% chance that there's not rain covers that. As long as someone doesn't say, there's a 100% chance or a 0% chance, it's really not an individual event, is not an individual probability, is not falsifiable. But there are different ways that you can sort of arrive at the probability calculus and some of the rules of probability, right? For example, that, an event and like not having that event should add up to one, right? So if I say there's a 60% chance of it raining, then there should be a 40% chance of it not raining tomorrow. And so Bayes' theorem that Thomas Bayes sort of discovered it's sort of based on this regularity and this ability to apply the probability calculus to events. And so for him, he says, look, because there's this regularity and it follows these mathematical laws, for me, that's proof that God exists, because there's this regularity to the universe. But in the 20th century, such arguments tend not to hold as much scientific water as they did in the 19th century. And so there are a variety of ways that people sort of get to the probability calculus. But one of the the sort of enduring ways that people keep coming back to is what's called the Dutch book argument. And basically, a Dutch book is a gambling situation where no matter you wager a certain amount of money on different bets, and no matter what happens, you lose money. So there are three horses in a race, and you bet maybe on two of them, or on all three of them in various proportions. And if you convert your probabilities to betting contracts, so if you think that a coin is 2/3 likely to land on heads and 1/3 on tail, then you would bet 2-to-1 odds on a betting contract, and you can derive the entire probability calculus out of the desire not to have a Dutch book made against you. So if you think that, or there's a 60% chance of rain and then a 70% chance of it not raining, you can convert those to contracts and show how if it rains or it doesn't rain, you would still end up losing money. And so in this kind of deeply metaphysical way, I think you see with the Dutch book argument that the sort of the entire edifice of probability and statistics is founded on this idea of the market and on the exchange of contracts. So I think there's this kind of internal metaphysical relationship between statistics and the market, or at least political economy. But then also what I argue in the book is that there's a sort of an external one as well, that these systems are kind of constantly making decisions in a world where they are developed by corporations and the government, and they're constantly tied back into ways to make money, which becomes the sort of the important way that truth is determined. And so two of the examples that I talk about in the book are Volkswagen's diesel scandal, where they had cars that would detect if they were being tested by the Environmental Protection Agency or other similar agencies, and then they would change how they functioned based on if they were being tested. And the other one is Project Greyball, which was a project by Uber to detect if someone opening the app was a governmental regulator, and then they would try to hide all of the rides from them. And so I think you can see in these examples that these modes of producing knowledge, both internally in terms of the Dutch book, but then externally are embedded in these systems of political economy, and are optimized not for some sort of transcendent idea of truth, but for the ability to sort of produce the most value for the owners and creators of these algorithms.
Well, I definitely want to speak about the epistemological foundations of these models, epistemology being, the theory of knowledge and how we come to know something and what sort of knowledge is produced. But first, I think it's worthwhile to explain how your book is so deeply based on Karl Marx's Capital and his conception of objectification. So Marx says that social relations are essentially negotiated through objects, and there's this sort of false consciousness which develops because you tend to treat these relations as being immutable or fixed, or as something that's natural in a sense. And you use this interpretation of objectification, whereas some other people focus on objectification as being the sort of dehumanization of the worker. But I really like the way you used or you deployed objectification in your book. So why don't we speak about how you developed your analysis using Marx's objectification?
Yeah. So for me, what I find really interesting about this theory of objectification, especially as it's developed, in the first volume of Capital, is that what I read Marx talking about is essentially the way that we let objects think for us and sort of remember us. I think he says, manage our affairs behind our backs. And so, you think like you go and you buy a cup of coffee and you're at the store and the sign says it's $2 or $3 or whatever for a cup of coffee. It becomes this objective fact that you have to respond to, not this sort of, it's not something where you can say, oh no, I think, for me, it's only worth $1.50 or something like that. And we, we have this implicit idea that like the $2 is somehow inherent in the coffee itself. And so in a lot of ways, I think what Marx is talking about in terms of objectification is this sort of almost like proto algorithmicity, I guess we could say, And that I think there's a way in which at one point in the book I say that like capitalism is the kind of the original machine learning, right? It's this way, this kind of this complex social network that tracks prices and value and labor, and presents it when we go to the store as the price of bread, or we pay rent to a landlord or something like that. And so I'm really interested in the ways in which probability does something similar, that it kind of becomes this sort of this objectified thing that, and algorithms too, that keep track of our affairs for us. So, you can think of credit scores as a thing that does this, right? That, that even though it's this totally made up thing, the idea that, oh, you should get a credit card or a mortgage and it'll improve your credit score, it becomes this sort of this objective game that we get caught in, right? That like, it's metaphysical, it's not a real thing, but we know that certain actions will improve our credit score, which increase our access to capital, or to credit at least, and other things will hurt our credit score. So even, and you can say, okay, this is ridiculous, I don't want to play this game, but if you want to get a mortgage or a car loan or something like that, you get sort of caught in the objective conditions of credit scores. And so I think there's something really interesting about the ways in which these algorithms and capital think for us. And one thing that one argument that I try to make in the book that I think is really important is that I'm not like opposed. The argument isn't that Bayesian statistics are like these bad bourgeois statistics and that we need to come up with a new system of doing statistics. I think in a lot of ways the Bayesian revolution and the Bayesian discovery is an incredibly important one, because it shows the ways in which all of this knowledge production is this sort of objectifying force, and one that's tied to political economy, that we can't, that there's not a way that we can like go back to this enlightenment idea of transcendent truth or something like that.
Well, you also speak about Moishe Postone, who is a historical Marxist, and he speaks about abstract domination and real abstraction. So essentially, these models are taking, observed phenomena or certain assumptions and feeding them into a model, and then you have your output. But I'm wondering, I mean, someone who's not a statistician myself, like, do these models really reflect the materiality of the world, or is there any way to make them reflect the world in a more, I don't want to say accurate way, because truth is something that's always mediated, but is there a way to make these models more reflective of material conditions and inequalities?
Yeah, that's a really good question, and I think it's kind of a complicated one in a certain sense, because I do think my argument isn't like I was saying that these are sort of like bad, inaccurate descriptions of the world. I think they actually are incredibly powerful tools that do describe the real material conditions, but precisely in a way that I think you can get from Postone or people like Sandra Thel, that we live in this world of these real abstractions, right? That credit scores and value are these very, even though they're not material things per se, right? Like Marx says that that there's no advances in chemistry that will ever allow us to like find the value in cloth or something like that. But that doesn't mean that cloth or coffee or a house doesn't have value in a real sense. It's not it's not just a fiction that we can wish away, or that there's some advances in either bourgeois economics or Marxism that will ever like figure out the real value of a cup of coffee or something like that. But these are they're socially produced, they're abstractions, but they are very real in a certain kind of materialist sense. But the problem, and I think this was what you were getting at, is that they reflect a world that's fundamentally biased and unjust and exploitative. And so I think it's a very difficult thing, and I think I would have been more concrete in the end about what the path forward was if I knew exactly what the path forward is. But I think it has to be, we have to address these things on sort of both ends of the spectrum, right? We have to address the sort of the kind of concrete outcomes, the injustices that these systems produce, the sort of, the ways in which they're racist and sexist and xenophobic. But then we also have to attack and reconceptualize the very sort of metaphysical value relations that allow these systems to produce and reproduce. And so, it's a question of both, discussing and dealing with the outcomes of them, but then also trying to reimagine the entire system of political economy and how we, distribute goods and organize labor and the social production of these real abstractions.
Well, why don't we stay on this for a bit, because there's something in your book which was, very interesting. I mean, you're saying that you're not trying to de-objectify these statistical models. You're not saying that we should do away with technology, whereas, some people want some return to, not having any technology because all technology is bad according to their view. But I wonder to what extent that is actually possible. Like, if these statistical models have a certain way of abstraction and potentially misrepresenting certain things in the world, and how is it that we can still use them for emancipatory or equitable ends? Is it just changing what the aim is? Is it, instead of saying, okay, we're using this model to see what the payout is to ensure that, there's a certain amount of profit maximization, but if the aim is then some sort of, redistribution of wealth or something that's equitable, can you just plug that aim or change the aim of these models? Or are they going to sort of, do they have, I don't want to say a mind of their own, because I don't think artificial intelligence is really intelligent. It doesn't have a psyche based on what we put into these models. But do you think it's actually possible for these sorts of models, which are based on abstraction, to actually be of service to an emancipatory project?
Yeah, so I think there are two levels to which I think it's important to answer that question. And so the first is, I think at some point it's impossible to step outside of abstractions and these sort of forms of objectification, that we're always involved in the world through various abstractions. We're never actually like dealing with the sort of just the soil under our feet. It's always functioning as land, or as as something potentially productive, or some form of knowledge. So that even outside of capitalism, I think that there are always forms of abstraction, forms of objectification. And so it's a question of sort of what, not of objectification being in and of itself bad, but precisely what it is that's objectified, and the types of abstractions, and what sort of reality, real abstractions they end up producing. But specifically with that sort of in mind, specifically to the question of technology, for me, I sort of fall in the middle, right? Like, I don't see myself as a technological determinist. I don't think that the sort of the outcome of what these tools and systems do is wholly predetermined. But I'm also not on the end of the spectrum where I think, okay, it's just a tool and it's totally up to you how to use it. I think it's somewhere in between, that there's a lot of sort of freedom in how we use these tools. They can be put to different ends. But they do carry certain kind of, they sort of smuggle with them certain metaphysical understandings of the world and ways of operating. And so we can't simply choose not to, we can't just say like, oh, I'm going to take AI and do something totally different and have it be completely removed from the market, because I think we're sort of stuck in a certain sense in these metaphysical systems. So I think they can be put towards emancipatory projects, that we can, try to use them, think of other ways to weight them, to think about evaluating the outcomes, like especially if we think about the implication on, in terms of climate or something like that, that those models can be used to calculate those things. But it's always difficult, because both internally they kind of have this market-driven metaphysics, but then also, like a lot of emancipatory projects, they exist within a world that's predominantly capitalist, and there's a tendency for capitalism to subsume these things and continually kind of eat them up and and reconfigure them in ways that continue to build these systems of domination and exploitation. So that's maybe the long answer, but the short answer is yes, I think they can be used for emancipatory projects, but there's no guarantee that any project, despite just because of our will that it should be emancipatory, is going to succeed in being emancipatory.
And there's, of course, always the issue of what Mark Fisher terms capitalist realism, where the way that we view things is always sort of limited by the capitalist confines in which we live. So it's really hard to think beyond those parameters. But I also wanted to speak about something that's a bit, something that's been in the news recently, and this idea of the Google search engine always giving you the best results. I think that's been problematized recently, where sometimes like the search results that you get are kind of random or not accurate. And some people argue that that's a result of monopolization. Google has a huge, or has they've monopolized that sector of the market, so there's no competition, and so they don't need to optimize or improve their product. But aside from that, and looking at the big picture, is it possible that some of these AI machine learning systems are just generating nonsense? Or like, what is the knowledge that they are producing? Can we term it as knowledge, or is this something else that is clouding our intellect?
Yeah, I think that there is a way in which they're producing knowledge. They're producing a certain sort of gloss on what exists out there. This kind of this sort of like socially, to some extent, maybe there's a certain analogy, and I'd have to think through this more, but it's sort of a kind of a like knowledge, maybe version of like socially necessary labor time, right? It's like a kind of average sort of socially produced knowledge is being kind of smashed together and produced. But I think that the risk is that that right now it's slurped up all this data based on a lot of things that people have written and artists have drawn and created. But it's also sort of, the problem is that it's churning out so much text, so many images that are then going to get sucked back up into the future versions of these. And there's been some studies recently where they've trained AI, these large language models, on the output of earlier iterations of large language models, and they just sort of go completely off on their own and become increasingly incomprehensible. And so I think that there is a distinct risk that rather than these systems getting better, we're going to actually see them get worse and worse, in this precisely the same way that I think that Google search has gone downhill significantly, that they've sort of they're losing the battle to search engine optimization and people gaming the systems. And we'll see AIs producing, content and then sucking that back up and producing weirder and weirder content and going off, sort of on their own. There was one paper I was reading, this was a few years ago, about they had like two AIs that were like talking to each other, and they eventually kind of just created their own language, that was completely incomprehensible to people. And I think that maybe that's the direction that this will go, rather than this fantasy of it becoming, more and more accurate or anything like that.
Well, if it's possible that these AI models will deteriorate, I mean, what will be the role of data pools potentially getting poisoned? I was recently reading an article about China's AI and how they're worried, whether this worry is warranted or not, but they're worried of, some of their systems being hacked and certain data being inputted into their data sets, which would then, I guess, skew the results or make these models not work properly. And I wonder if would that be a problem that could be a long run issue and that could impact a lot of different models, and what would the outcome of that be then?
Yeah, I think that's it is likely to become an increasingly bigger problem. And I think it sort of gets back to the ways in which a lot of these algorithms are designed basically to produce the most value, rather than some sort of other measure of knowledge is that it becomes, this sort of this arms race. We could think about it too in terms of global competition. That it becomes easier to like poison your adversary's, pool of data than to improve your own pool of data. And so I think there's a lot of ways in which where people speak about, sort of crises of truth and crises of science. But I think at some sort of fundamental level, they're primarily crises of capitalism. That sort of capitalism is based on this kind of, or has become, informational capitalism on the mass extraction of knowledge. And I think that the ways in which knowledge production is becoming incentivized, that even aside from malicious actors, there's going to be this tendency towards these data pools becoming worse and worse and lower quality, to the point where these systems, these algorithmic systems of socially averaging knowledge, will, like you said, just become increasingly worthless and unusable. And I think maybe there's a risk that that capitalism is kind of maybe at the maybe this is a bad analogy and maybe I should think through it more, but even with that said, that there's sort of this kind of in the same way that capitalism has destroyed the physical environment, I think that we're entering a point where capitalism is risking destroying the sort of the informational environment in which we live in, and sort of both poisoning it, but also this sort of what we might call like data pollution or something like that, just producing these sort of constant streams of increasingly lower quality bad data.
So it essentially creates its own raison d'etre as well as its demise.
Yes, exactly. That's a very good way to put it.
I was actually wondering why you focus so heavily on Marx. I mean, I'm totally partial to his analysis, but what was it in Capital that made you think, okay, I can tie this to what's going on with statistical models, financialization, political economy, etc.?
Ooh, that's a good question. I mean, I think I've always been drawn to a certain kind of Marxist analysis, but I do think it's really this idea of objectification is one that I find incredibly persuasive, and thinking about the ways in which we let systems sort of think for us, because that's really what it seems to me that we're doing with algorithms, is we're sort of saying, okay, we'll write this code, it works, and then we'll kind of just set it aside and we'll let it manage our affairs. So I think that's really what drew me to this kind of Marxist analysis. And then there's also this sort of, in my mind, this kind of analogy between the ways in which value functions as this kind of metaphysical supplement, right? Like there's, that we have these systems of producing and comprehending value, that seems kind of analogous to the way in which probability works, that it's not really something that actually exists in the world, but it's an incredibly powerful tool that people use to understand the world, with all sorts of consequences.
And there's another thing you address in the book, which is this idea of the revolutionary or political subject, because Marx speaks about this subject, this ahistorical, trans-historical subject, which is about to bring about the revolution, essentially. And, you give various examples as to why this concept doesn't always hold water. It's, largely based around like a Western, potentially male subject, doesn't account for various forms of colonization or oppression that have taken place around the world, where that political subject might be different and might not be determined by the same sort of historical forces that Marx speaks about. So how do we get around that problem? I mean, who is the subject in potentially using these models for something that's more or less malevolent, and something that's better, essentially? Is there no such a thing? Should we do away with that concept altogether of the revolutionary subject, or is there another way of understanding it?
Yeah, so I think in a lot of ways, I very much appreciate Moishe Postone's analysis when he says, right, that the subject of capitalism is not, is neither the capitalist nor the worker, but it's actually capital is the subject. It's what sort of makes these kind of decisions for us. And that in a lot of ways that we even though we sort of feel like we get to choose these kind of things, in a lot of ways, it is these larger structures that make decisions for us, right? It's exactly like we were talking about. You can sort of do whatever you want, but at the end of the day, you have to work in order to make money, to pay rent and buy bread at market and stuff like that. And so I'm not entirely opposed to the idea of some sort of revolutionary subject, but I think what interests me much more is thinking about the ways that we can actually change the sort of objective conditions under which we find ourselves, so that these changes come about sort of objectively, not in the sort of traditional understanding of objectively, but in this kind of Marxist understanding. And so, it becomes less a sort of a voluntaristic or a willful, kind of sovereign decision to change the world, but this kind of tinkering and playing with the sort of the social rules under which we exist to create more emancipatory potential. Yeah, I think that's probably a good description of how I think about these things. But I find that sort of the sovereign subject to be a very difficult and tricky thing for all the reasons that you mentioned, and so sort of I guess the hope of the book is maybe that there's this kind of this other area that we can work on these problems that don't involve kind of reimagining a sort of a traditional political subject.
Well, Justin, Joque, it was really great speaking to you about your book, Revolutionary Mathematics. I thought it provided a really great overview of, the history of how these statistical models have been developed and how these models are currently being used in the service of capital and what might be done about it, even though obviously there's no one-size-fits-all solution to what can be done. But I think you really illustrate how these models are often working against us and controlling us to a certain degree. And so I think just being cognizant of that fact is important in and of itself.
Well, thanks so much, Talia. This has been a really fun conversation.
And thank you for watching theAnalysis.news. If you haven't done so already, please go to our website, theAnalysis.news. Consider donating to the show by hitting the button at the top right corner of the screen. And also like and subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Analysis-News, and subscribe to whatever podcasts you're using to watch this show. So please do visit us again, and I hope you enjoyed this content. See you next time.